Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View. And first of all, I want to wish all of you a happy Easter. Hope you had a great Easter weekend. Of course, we're past that now. But I thought I might just point out for a minute, we did have something very unusual we didn't really talk about before we went off the air on Thursday. And that is, it is very unusual that you have both Easter and Passover and Ramadan in the same time period. Partially because Ramadan is the 9th lunar month that moves around. Of course, Passover is a little bit different, although there's obviously a correlation between Passover and Easter or Resurrection Day. But nevertheless, it was one of those times where you have, if you will, the three large theistic world religions all basically celebrating over the weekend. And the New York Times, thinking that this would be such a good idea to address religion, decided to post an op-ed piece saying it's time for us to get rid of the idea of God. Really? Anyway, the argument being made by this individual who, as best I can determine, is kind of a secular Jew, a person who has a Jewish background but is really an atheist at heart, is that we can't really believe in God because he's malevolent, he's genocidal, this idea of what's taught in the Bible, we need to just reject all of that, which is kind of a preview for what we're going to talk about next hour, because we're going to have Dr. Paul Copan with us, and he is going to address what he says is the question I most ask. And since he has, over these years, written some excellent books on the subject of, is God a moral monster? Is God a vindictive bully? I mean, I hate to even use the phrases, but that's what a lot of the so-called new atheists have said. We'll talk about what is, I think, the question he gets most often. And we've posted that. By the way, he co-authored that piece because then later Melissa Cain Travis answered the question she's most asked. And maybe we'll get her on to talk about that. I'm going to just give him the entire time that we'll spend in that first half hour of next hour. So, again, you can be looking to that. Let me also mention that we're going to get into some of the issues in the news. Matter of fact, I'm going to talk about all sorts of victories that you'll probably only hear about here on Point of View and nowhere else. So we'll talk about those victories in just a minute. But at the bottom of the hour, we'll be talking with Eric Ortlund. His book is entitled Suffering Wisely and Well. It is a book that has been very well endorsed and promoted by Johnny Erickson Tada, by Russell Moore, and other people that we've had on the program. So I think it will be an opportunity to address, again, one of those important issues that we like to talk about here on Point of View. But let's talk about some victories, if you will. You always like to hear those, don't you? Well, the first one is an article by Jonathan Turley. Now, again, let me remind you, Jonathan Turley is a liberal. He's really a liberal's liberal. He has made it very clear that he's voted for Hillary Clinton every time he could to, voted for Joe Biden. He is the professor of public interest at George Washington University. But you know you're losing when your fellow liberals are saying this is a really bad idea. And what he's talking about here is Twitter, and it's facing the reality that it is being perceived, I think accurately so, as being against the idea of free speech. Who would have thought? So, again, he says, Twitter's board of directors gathered this week to sound what looks like a suicide pact. A lot of that's happened over the weekend, so I'll bring you up to date. They unanimously voted for what's called a poison pill. That's where they would issue more shares, essentially tanking the value of the shares that exist and trying to flood the number of shares out there so that Elon Musk would have less of an impact and make it much more difficult, almost impossible, for him to take over the company. A little bit later, he says, then here's the interesting thing. Company boards have a fiduciary duty to do what is best for shareholders, which usually is measured in share values. Twitter has long done the opposite, he says. It has virtually written off many conservatives and a large portion of its prospective market with years of arbitrary censorship. This is a liberal talking about Twitter and talking about the censorship of dissenting views on everything from gender identity to global warming, election fraud, and the pandemic. He goes on a little bit later in talking about how they even suspended the libs of TikTok. Not that we quote TikTok here very often, although my girls tend to watch it, because TikTok just posted some criticisms of liberals which were posted by liberals. These are liberals posting criticism of liberals said about themselves, which shows you how touchy-feely and almost overreacting Twitter has become. But anyway, he says a company also seemingly has written off free speech, and then points out that the Twitter CEO, Agrawal, actually has said that his company is not bound by the First Amendment and will regulate content as reflective of things that we believe lead to a healthier public discussion. So, again, even though Jonathan Turley would certainly hold to this idea of promoting liberal ideas and progressive ideas, he's still one of the remaining liberals, and I give him high praise for that, of believing in free speech. He goes on to say that for social media companies, free speech is not only ethically but economically beneficial because the censorship model, which is what he's talking about Twitter being right now, only works if you have an effective monopoly in which customers have no choice. That is how Henry Ford could tell his customers back when he controlled car making that they could have any color of Model T they'd like as long as it's black. He says censorship, or content modification as the company refers to it, is not value maximizing for Twitter. It is status enhancing for executives like the CEO of Twitter. And then points out that as bad as that has been with what Twitter has done, what I think is even interesting is then he starts quoting a number of individuals, some of whom I mentioned the other day, but it's worth recounting some of those. For example, Max Boot, who decades ago was on Point of View with me, writing in the Washington Post, declared that for democracy to survive, we need more content moderation, not less. In other words, we need more censorship, not less censorship. Okay. MSNBC's Katie Tur warned that reintroducing free speech values on Twitter would produce, are you ready for this? A massive life and globe-altering consequences for just letting people run wild on the thing. And then, of course, I quoted the other day Robert Reich, who was the labor secretary under Bill Clinton, who basically has said that we have to, in a sense, censor because, after all, he warned that censorship is necessary to protect American democracy. Then he delivered a line that he said would make Big Brother blush. This again from Jonathan Turley, our liberal friend here, that Musk's dream and Trump's and Putin's and the dream of every dictator, strongman, demagogue, and modern-day robber baron on earth. For the rest of us, it would be a brave new nightmare. In other words, his argument is that when you allow free speech, well, that's what dictators want. I don't think so. That's what strongmen want. I don't think so. That's what demagogues want, or robber barons. But nevertheless, he concludes by pointing out the fact that almost every poll shows that, in round numbers, about 3/4 of all Americans do not want the social media to control their values. And also in a poll, 3/4 of Americans also are convinced that the primary focus of the mainstream media is to advance their own opinions and their own political agenda. Well, that's just one. I've got some better ones. As a matter of fact, some court rulings and a lot of victories taking place. And if you keep tuned into Point of View, we'll talk about each one of them right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Today, your income taxes are due. Of course, those are just some of the taxes you pay each year. This increasing list of taxes we pay are why Kevin Williamson argues that we have enough taxes. He wrote his column because President Biden has been proposing a billionaire's tax that would essentially tax imaginary income. You pay capital gains taxes on income you receive. You don't pay taxes on assets that increase in value that you've not received as income. Biden wants to change that. This is a bad idea for many reasons. First, the value of assets not only go up, they also go down. Think of the stock market. Think of the estimated value of a home that decreases significantly during a housing collapse. Second, the value of an asset can best be assigned when the sale is made. As I said in a commentary recently, my kids used to ask me what something was worth. My standard answer was, it's only worth what another person will pay for it. But, Kevin Williamson also raises another question about the sheer number of taxes. For example, we have taxes on incomes, payroll, capital gains, dividends, tariffs, estates, gasoline, and diesel. We also have such things as tobacco excises, liquor excises, Affordable Care Act excises, and much, much more. We aren't just talking about taxes we need to pay today. We're talking about taxes all the time, often in ways we don't even notice. I wonder if this is by design. In my previous commentary, I asked you to imagine what would happen if we were to pay all our taxes in one lump sum. We would probably have a tax revolt. But when we pay lots of taxes every day and have taxes deducted from our paychecks, well, we don't notice. But we should. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Inflation, go to viewpoints.info/inflation. That's viewpoints.info/inflation.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's see if we can talk about a couple more victories. In just a minute, I want to get to our second article, Disney throwing in the towel, which again is a victory. But I thought I'd skip over to spend just a few minutes, and a very short number of minutes, with one which I entitled Another Freedom Victory. And this is where the university has decided to pay, you ready for this, $400,000 to a professor who is punished, and his crime, because he refused to use a student's preferred pronouns. And it all developed at Shawnee State University up there in Ohio. You listeners up there are probably somewhat familiar with this, but let's tell the rest of the country, in which you have this professor. He's a philosophy professor, Nick Merriweather. And this was a ruling that originally went against him, because what happened is back in January, when he referred to this individual, he said, "Yes, sir." And I always try, again, it makes it a gender issue, but I'll say, "Yes, ma'am, yes, sir." I always try to treat whoever is asking a question, and of course, whether I'm in a classroom or whether I'm in a church, I always say that. Well, he said, "Yes, sir." Well, the student afterwards came up to the professor and said, "I'm transgender, and I want you to refer to me as yes, ma'am," or his, no longer his, but her. And going forward, I want you to include feminine titles and pronouns. Well, he said, I really can't do that. And my Christian you're obviously a man. I know you identify that way. Well, you know what goes next. He files a complaint with the university, opens an investigation into the incident. The university found the professor created, quote, I'm quoting now, effectively created a hostile environment, unquote, by not using a student by their preferred pronouns. He even offered to just say, I'll call you by name, Bob, or even if you want to be Sue, fine, but I'm not going to use these pronouns and all of that. But the student didn't accept that report, so the university placed a warning in his file and also was calling for further corrective actions. Now, if you have tenure, that's not good news. If you don't have tenure, that's the end of your career. So you can kind of figure out where that goes, right? Okay. I won't go into all the details. We do have the article. You can read it for yourself. But first, of course, there was a district court that dismissed the lawsuit. That didn't go very well. And so the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit said, nope, he has his right. This is called religious liberty. It's called freedom of speech. And as a matter of fact, you need to now pay $400,000 to cover all of the various expenses, the legal expenses and all of the rest. And I think it is a great precedent, which maybe if other universities are paying attention, might cause them to rethink whether or not they want to punish a professor for simply saying, I can't in good conscience call somebody standing in front of me who looks like a boy, looks like a young man, he is fine, she is not, and his is okay, her is not. And so those are some victories, but that now lets me get to the second article, which comes from Kyle Smith, who actually does a fair amount of job really kind of covering entertainment, but he actually wrote this piece, which we've posted. You can read it in its entirety. In Florida, Disney is throwing in the towel. He said, remember that hot cultural controversy of about 2 weeks ago? The media was trying to keep it going for a while, but it looks like that Disney decided to kind of give up and thought better of taking on Ron DeSantis in Florida. And its current strategy is forget we said anything at all. A little bit later in the piece, he says Disney, with the full weight of showbiz culture behind it, thought it was playing with house money. What could go wrong by proclaiming yourself to be opposed to homophobia? Plenty, it turned out. American consumers are irritated with companies that take partisan political positions on controversial topics. It now appears that Disney never should have injected itself into the debate in the first place. So its new tact is to avail itself of the opportunity of choosing tactful silence and hoping the whole thing will go away. But also one of the things that Kyle Smith mentions is that's not only a good example of Disney being the dog that doesn't bark, it sort of has shown up everywhere else, because he says not only is Disney backing down, note that a bill that really had nothing to do with Disney in the first place. That is, of course, you are familiar with the parental rights bill and legislation. Disney is simply a large company that, like many other large companies, does business in Florida. Did any other large corporation speak up about this bill? Not that I've heard of. Coming on the heels of the boycott Georgia debacle that happened just a year ago, the lack of organized corporate opposition to the Florida law should be an indicator that American firms have changed their minds about the wisdom of taking overly progressive positions on decisive issues. I did not post this one because it just came out today, but it's by our friend Charlie Cook, who writes with National Review, in which he says, in some quarters, you oftentimes hear, especially those on the so-called political right, that has become kind of an article of faith that when the wishes of conservatives are pitted against the wishes of the progressive movement and its allies in the press, academia, Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and even the basically Dow Jones, S&P 500, conservatives always lose. And he said this isn't true. Not only is the conservative movement making dramatic strides on abortion, religious liberty, charter schools, on the right to keep and bear arms, on another core cultural issues, but the claim is contradicted by the most recent fight for which we have results. And he first of all talks about Georgia, and our listeners in Georgia well aware of the fact that it was such a big issue with the All-Star game last year, but even he says now, after he goes through all the things and moving the All-Star game out of Atlanta, having it in Denver, and all sorts of other things, he concludes by saying even the fiercest opponents of the election integrity laws in Georgia are now admitting that that protest was a mistake. Or, he says, to put it another way, conservatives won. There's no reason to believe things will go differently with the fight over gender ideology to K through 3 curriculum in Florida, which, of course, is the one we were just talking about. And he gives us a couple of reasons why. First, he says, Disney has picked an extremely dangerous topic on which to stake its reputation. When described neutrally, the bill that Disney opposes is not only popular among Floridians and Americans, but it's popular among a majority of Floridians of all parties. In some circumstances, you might imagine that wouldn't matter to the eventual outcome. Were this a complicated tax dispute, for example, public's eyes would glaze over. But it's a dispute about the education of their children, and people are paying attention. That's my add to that. He says, second of all, Disney's opponents are extremely strong at present. They have every incentive in the world to dig in. The political party that passed the bill Disney opposes through the Florida legislature has been in charge of the state since 1999 and is expected to pick up more seats in November. Of course, they're also going against another individual, which we'll get into in just a minute. That is the governor, Ron DeSantis, as well. And he says, third, Disney has next to no political leverage. It is internally divided, as I pointed out to you before. There are people in the Disney Corporation right now that have been filing petitions and getting people signing petitions saying, I want us to get out of this battle. We should stay neutral on some of these cultural issues. It's not helping the Disney brand. Of course it's not. But anyway, he says, again, they did not plan for this crisis in the first place. And again, he goes into some of the reasons why. Part of the decision about challenging this did not come from the people in Florida, came from the people with the Disney Corporation in California. And if nothing else, they probably didn't understand that Florida, California, just a little bit different. Just look at who the governor is. Look who's in the legislature. And if you wanted to be kind of wise about this, you can see part of the issue. So again, he goes into some other really interesting aspects of this as well. But you are starting to see almost everywhere you look that corporations that have been trying to promote a woke agenda aren't necessarily doing very well economically, and they aren't really all that successful. And the experiences in Georgia and now in Florida, not to mention just a recent court case here in Ohio, are cause for us to be somewhat encouraged. I recognize that we still recognize that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, but I wanted you to be encouraged, and I think I've filled up this first half hour with a couple of stories that probably you only hear here on Point of View, and if you hear them elsewhere, well, great, but we wanted you to know that there's a lot of things to be encouraged about, and I am encouraged. Let's take a break, though. We have an opportunity now to talk with Eric Ortlund. We'll be connecting up with him in England, and we'll be talking about this new book, which is very well written and endorsed by a lot of people we think highly of, Suffering Wisely and Well, The Gift or the Grief of Job and the Grace of God. We'll talk about that right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
One of the topics we get into from time to time is the issue of evil and suffering. Matter of fact, next hour when we have Dr. Paul Copan, we're going to get into that issue of God and evil, even if God is a moral monster and some of those issues. But suffering is another part of that. And so this book that came out just a couple of months ago, it is published by our good friends at Crossway, Suffering Wisely and Well, The Grief of Job and the Grace of God, and some of the endorsements from people that we've had on this program, people like Johnny Erickson Tata and Russell Moore and others. And so a book that I think would be very helpful to you, especially if you've never delved into the book of Job, but also tried to begin to reconcile this issue of suffering in your life or the life of another. I certainly do commend this book to you. And it is written by Dr. Eric Ortlund, has his PhD from the University of Edinburgh, is an individual that teaches at Oak Hill College in London, England, and before that taught Old Testament at Briarcrest College and Seminary in Saskatchewan, Canada. Dr. Ortlund, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you very much for having me, Kerby. I'm glad to be here.
The endorsement by Johnny Erickson Tata talked about the fact that she says, I've lived long enough with suffering to know that it doesn't come in a one-size-fits-all. It's messy and confusing. And that really leads to a very helpful part of your book before we get into the book of Job, chapter 1, in which you talk about the varieties of suffering in the Bible and our response. Because sometimes we think that suffering is due either to a mistake that we've made, a bad choice we've made, or because of sin that is in our lives, or because maybe of persecution. But it's a little bit more complex than that, and that's why I appreciated you actually starting the book out with that chapter.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It seems to me that the book of Job, I think, Kerby, it's the one place in the canon where God reveals to us one dimension of suffering and one chapter that we might walk through in our life of discipleship that is different from any other kind of suffering in the Bible. We're much more familiar with categories, as you already mentioned, like suffering for our own sins. Sin always leads to suffering. It's an immutable law. Or suffering for spiritual growth. For reasons I go into in the book, I don't think that's what's going on in Job's case at all. I think that's very significant.
Oh, I think so, because just to mention it real quickly, you do have sections on, for example, suffering for sin and spiritual growth and suffering, because sometimes we recognize that that can be something that can be helpful, or, of course, persecution or the rest. And as you want to obviously make the case, you start out by talking about Job's integrity. When we get to his miserable comforters, you call him their torturers, whatever we want to call him, they want to accuse him of something. But the book of Job starts out with Job being an individual being commended by God, where then Satan says, okay, yeah, well, anybody that's doing as well as he is going to obviously honor God, but let me take it all away, and then we'll see how much he honors you. So the first principle is his integrity, and that's really established early on, isn't it?
It is. It's one of the most remarkable parts of the entire Bible that God is bragging about Job to the devil. I mean, isn't that amazing? One of the things I go into in the book is that God actually says there is no one like him in all the earth, like Job. If you look that phrase up in the Old Testament, there are a couple other times it's used for human beings, but for the most part, you find that phrase being used by human beings for God, like there's no God like you in all the earth. And God takes that phrase and uses it to describe Job. That's a pretty good thing to have on your resume. And it's really important that, now, okay, let me back up a little bit. What's so moving about the book of Job is that Job never learns that. By the end of the book, he knows that God is not his enemy, God is his friend, but he never learns the just staggeringly high regard, and if I can put it this way, the fatherly pride that God has in his saints who suffer and who don't understand and who say some foolish things, but stick with God anyway. And then, as you said, the devil's question right after it is honestly one of the most unnerving questions in all the Bible, and gets to the heart of a key issue in the book.
I want to get to the question, but I thought I'd just add one more point, because you made the case that, of course, there's none like him on earth, but you also point out that he refers to Job, my servant, and it wasn't until I read your book that I realized That puts him in pretty exalted company, because you can have Abraham is called my servant, Moses is called my servant, and David is called my servant. Now, again, if you were to go back, Eric, and say, okay, who would maybe be the top 4 people that God commends in the Old Testament, I'm pretty sure Elijah would be in there. Of course, Moses, Abraham, David would be there. I'm not sure you put Job in there, but if you, again, and you're the expert on the Old Testament, if you use that phraseology, Job is in the pantheon, if you will, with Abraham, Moses, and David.
You're absolutely right. He's one of the heroes of the Old Testament, and God thinks so. He's bragging about him to the devil. But as far as Job thinks, God is angry with him for no reason. It's deeply moving to me that God lets Job fall into a position where his true status and standing before God looks completely different from what it actually is. And I think that's part of what's so uniquely painful and confusing about a Job-like ordeal that isn't there in other kinds of suffering.
Sure. Well, again, you talked about the accuser's question. Let's get to that, because after all, that's the premise for the rest of what unfolds in the book of Job, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, it is. So just that terrible question, does Job love God for no reason, or in vain, or for nothing?
Yeah.
And the obvious answer implied is no. The devil says, of course Job says he loves you, but he's a gold digger. He doesn't really care about you. He just really loves the nice life you give him. You take that away, and you will see how Job really feels about you. Job, in other words, the devil says, Job is he's tolerating a God he secretly hates. And if God takes away Job's only reason for being in the relationship, the charade will stop. It's just, I'm uncomfortable every time I read it. Mm-hmm. Because the issue there is, do we really love God for God's sake? There's a sense in which the book of Job, really what it's about, to use New Testament language, it's about the all-surpassing worth of knowing Yahweh. All-surpassing, surpassing even the worth of knowing my own children. Now, every Christian knows we should love God more than any of the gifts he gives us. But it is easy without realizing it to slip into a pattern with God where we treat him like a business partner or a Santa Claus. I think what God is revealing in the book of Job, very movingly and not exactly comfortingly, is that God will occasionally allow us to lose something really precious to us, so that the true quality of our love can be exposed, of our love for God can be exposed. There's something profoundly moving when Job is not a stoic. He doesn't suppress his grief. He's dressed in sackcloth and ashes, and he's bawling his eyes out over what he's lost. And then he says, naked I came, naked I'll go. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord anyway. God is no less to be blessed when he takes away than when he gives. That is amazing. That's amazing. But every Christian has to say that at some way, at some point in our earthly journey, because the whole point to heaven will be enjoying God for God. If I can't learn to do that to some extent now, I'm going to be bored in heaven. If I can't learn how to love God more than I love my wife and my family and my job and good health and so on, I'm going to be bored in heaven, because I'm going to lose all that.
Wow, very good. We need to take a break, but I thought I'd at least set it up and come back after the break, because you have a section about those around Job, and oftentimes we call them miserable counselors, or you refer to them as Job's torturers, the psychology of legalism, the beauty of gospel friendship. And it reminded me, even as we were going through this once again, of stories I've heard. I'm thinking of Joe Bailey in his book, The View from a Hearst. I'd lost, I think it was when, I don't know if he lost his first or second son, but he lost his son anyway. Had an individual come in and share all these verses and all these scriptural principles and things that I knew, and he said, I couldn't wait for him to leave. Then I had another friend come in, and he just prayed with me, cried with me, and I hated to see him go. And there is a sense in which, if nothing else, those of us who are around others who are suffering, we might learn some vicarious lessons about what you refer to as Job's torturers, the moralism that exists there, kind of the theological ideas that are being presented and all the rest. So we want to take a break. We want to come back and get into that. And then, of course, get to the conclusion. But it's a fascinating book, and I think it would be very helpful. If you've always read through the Bible but don't really know what to do with the book of Job, if you've ever struggled with what about suffering in your life or the life of others, the loss of a loved one, this might be a book that would be very helpful. And again, endorsed by such people as Johnny Erickson Tata, Russell Moore, and many others. It's published by Crosswhite, came out a couple months ago. We have information about it on our website, and we'll continue with Dr. Eric Ortlund right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we talk about the book Suffering Wisely and Well, The Grief of Job and the Grace of God. Dr. Eric Ortlund is with us. He is the author. It is published by Crossway. Easy to find probably in your local bookstore, but if not, we have a link so that you can get it in paperback or Kindle. And Eric, I thought for just a minute we might then talk about the psychology of legalism and the temptation to blame, because in some respects, whether we go through suffering, we know people that do, and I can learn some lessons about how to speak to Job, in some cases, how not to speak to Job or a modern-day Job. Help us out.
Sure. It's a really important question. So much of the book of Job is just the characters talking to each other, And so much of what the friends say, it's fascinating the way it's been written. I think the author really understands human psychology. The friends will begin by saying a number of entirely plausible and even to some extent biblically justifiable things, but they cannot tolerate the idea of a sinless Job. They insist it must be, their only explanation for suffering is, you did something wrong, you got what you deserved. And it becomes clear as you read the book that the friends find this a deeply comforting idea. And this is just one of the many ways the book of Job is so relevant, because as you mentioned before the break, probably every single one of us has either seen or participated in a life as or Bildad like, quote unquote comforting of someone who's suffering. And we just heard them. The idea, the rigid mechanical idea that whenever there is suffering in the world, God is punishing someone for their sin, that is deeply comforting, because it means when we face suffering, it means it won't happen to us. It is really hard when you go to church and you see a brother or sister bawling their eyes out, and they have no idea why God let this happen. A big part of a Job-like ordeal is just this utter confusion and perplexity, where you're just minding your own business one day and God let something terrible happen, and you're thinking, oh, is he mad at me or what? And there doesn't seem to be any relief in sight. That is really hard to sit with, and it's hard to sit and be quiet and not start lecturing someone. And it is just really tempting to start implying to the person who's suffering, your Christian friend who's suffering, if you had done something different, maybe you wouldn't be suffering so much. I remember talking to a dear friend in the States who was going through a horrible divorce and just a bitter, ugly custody battle. And it came into my mind to say, well, maybe you should have been more careful before you married the man. And I just put my hand over my mouth, because I'm acting like Job's comforters there. I'm suggesting that it is her fault. And the reason why that's so sneaky is it's a way to insulate myself from that kind of suffering, because I haven't done the bad thing. It's a deeply seductive feeling to be able to comfort yourself and say, I will never go through that suffering because I'm morally superior to that person. I don't think it's wise to ever think that we're ever entirely free from that temptation.
One of the things you also talk about patient listening, the whole idea of listening to an individual patiently. And you think about James 1:9, for example, that we should be quick to listen and slow to speak. So whether you use the principles that we can derive from the Old Testament, the book of Job, or we go to the book of James or others, there is a value in being a good listener, isn't there?
There absolutely is. It's also really difficult to be a good listener. It is difficult, especially when someone you care about is hurting, to just sit and listen. But I really think one of maybe the first and most basic thing we're supposed to learn from the book of Job is just how little we know and how stupid it is to assume that we know what God is doing in someone's life when he allows suffering. The friends are absolutely certain they know. They're completely wrong.
Yes. So again, that's one of the chapters, but let's, if we can, talk about Job's limits, which I thought was very good. And then also ultimately worship and restoration, because Job ends with a positive note, but you can go through 36 chapters, I think something like that, before you find the final resolution. And some of us always want a happy ending. It does exist, but there's a lot that takes place before we get to that conclusion, isn't there?
There is, and I think that that's part of the skill and the genius with which the book is put together. The author is saying to us, you have a happy ending. And, Kerby, for anyone listening right now who is suffering and who is finding themselves, uncomfortably reminded of the book of Job in their own lives, something to hold on to is that it will not last forever. The nightmare will not last. But there's no quick and easy way through it. There's no quick and easy way through the book of Job. There's no quick and easy way through a Job-like ordeal. It's not exactly comforting, but yet I think the book is meant to tire us out and frustrate us, because that's a reflection of the experience it is describing.
So again, this is a book that I think a lot of people could use in their own personal study. They may be dealing with suffering, or they've always been a little bit troubled by the book of Job. And it seems to me that even, Eric, as I was going through this, I thought, I think I've probably taught almost every book in the Bible, except I don't think I've ever really taught in the book of Job. So there may be some people out there that are Sunday school teachers, maybe pastors, small group leaders, or others who could actually use this in a way that would be helpful in a group setting. And from time to time, you have a section in this book where you say, kind of, what have we learned here? And apply some of that. So there are some great sections where you actually give us kind of a summary, but the way you've put it together, it might even be a good small group study. What do you think?
Well, I hope so. I meant it like, yep. Kerby, like you, I don't think I've ever heard the book of Job preached on. It's kind of a sleeping giant in the Old Testament. I wrote the book as a way to say everything pastorally helpful about the book in as simple, clear, and direct a manner as possible. And I really do want it to be accessible and helpful to pastors, to teachers, to small group leaders, or just ordinary lay people. It's meant to be entirely just no mess, no frills, no fuss.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've taught Old Testament before. How do you put Job in the categories here? Because we oftentimes explain that it is one of the oldest books, but a lot of people have a real good idea. Okay, I know where the Torah is. I know where the prophets are. I know where the Psalms are. I just don't know what. And of course, I know where the history, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, but a lot of people don't know where to put Job. Help us out with that.
Sure. Well, yeah, and there's good reason for that. Job is confusing in more than one way. There's a little bit of a complexity here because it looks like the Hebrew is pre-exilic, so somewhere in between Genesis through Kings. However, Job is not an Israelite, and he probably didn't, well, do I want to say this? Probably didn't exactly speak Hebrew. Those people groups all sounded pretty similar to each other, but technically they're different languages. There's every indication that Job lives very, very, very early in redemptive history. So he offers sacrifice without a priest. He never mentions the covenant name Yahweh. Only the narrator does in chapters 1 and 2 and 42. They use an archaic term for God, Shaddai, which is from Exodus. So it looks like a later Holy Spirit-inspired Israelite narrator has taken an earlier story of a man who lived centuries before him and, guided by the Holy Spirit, written a book that is now part of sacred scripture. So I think Job himself is very ancient. The book, I'm not so sure about.
Oh, fascinating. Again, the book is entitled Suffering Wisely and Well. Lots of endorsements from people that we think highly of. It has been published by Crossway. Came out a couple of months ago. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but again, we have a link so that you can find it there. Also a link if you'd like to know more about Eric Ortlund and, of course, our friends at Crossway. And so I appreciate you writing the book. I appreciate you staying up a little bit later because, after all, it's probably dark where you are, and we're just in the middle of our afternoon. So, Eric, thank you for joining us, and it's been a delight to have you on the program.
Thank you very much for having me on your program, Kerby. God bless.
Again, professor at Oak Hill College in London, England, and they are probably getting ready to go to bed. And some of you, especially on the western part of this country, just getting started with your day. So it reminds us that we can talk to people all over the world. When we come back, though, we're going to talk with Dr. Paul Copan and then Dr. Melissa Cain Travis. All that coming up right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you were with me the first hour, I talked about the fact that we had something very unusual where you had Easter and the Passover and even Ramadan all happening at the same time. So how did the New York Times think that it should maybe commemorate that? Well, they posted an op-ed piece suggesting we need to get rid of the idea of God because, after all, God is a moral monster. Everything in the Old Testament is something we need to reject. Thank you, New York Times. That was a bad judgment for sure. But it also leads into some of the conversation we're going to have this hour, because there is a very good piece that came out in the Worldview Bulletin, and I've encouraged you to subscribe to it. I subscribe to it. And they have a section called The Question I've Asked Most, Part 1. We might eventually get into Part 2, but we have enough with Part 1 because we're going to be talking first with Dr. Paul Copan about the question he gets: is God a moral monster? Did God really command genocide? Is God a vindictive bully? A couple of his different books. And so we'll spend some time first with him, and then Dr. Melissa Cain Travis will be with us, and we'll talk about are there other extraterrestrials and aliens and those kinds of things. Going to be a fascinating conversation. Before we're done this hour, we'll also get back to some other issues in the news, a few other articles that I've posted. Paul Copan has been with us many times before, PhD in philosophy from Marquette University, a professor of philosophy and ethics, actually holds the chair there at Palm Beach Atlantic University, president of the Evangelical Philosophical Society. I mentioned just a few of his books, but this, I think, will be a great conversation we'll have today. So, Dr. Paul Copan, always great to have you on the program with us.
Hooray, good to be back on, Kerby. Thank you.
Well, this is part of a roundtable discussion where you ask your four regular contributors their most asked question. Not surprised that you get this one, because whenever I get that question, I point, first of all, to one of your books. Also, one of our colleagues at Pro Ministries did a week of radio programs on the so-called Yahweh Wars, because this is a troubling question about, as we look at the Old Testament, it seems like God is commanding genocide. You have been aware of the fact that we see those comments being made by Richard Dawkins and lots of people with the so-called new atheist. Shows up in, of all things, the New York Times over the weekend, which was a perfect news peg to hang on this. But how do we answer that? Because I want to give you some time to maybe get into that a little bit of detail, because it's a question you get all the time, and I suspect some of our listeners would like to know, how in the world do you respond to that?
Yeah, it's one that I think the new atheists have really brought to the center of the discussion. And so in many ways, we can thank the new atheists for raising these issues, and I think forcing Christians to wrestle with these questions and what may be a real obstacle to various folks. But I think it's important that we lay a little bit of the context as we seek to understand what's going on in these Old Testament settings, these passages, and so on. So I try to lay the general groundwork by talking about how a lot of the things that we assume about from our own day, we often superimpose upon the past, thinking that if the past isn't like the way we do things today, then it must be all bad, all wrong, and so forth. And C.S. Lewis talked about the danger of chronological snobbery, where we look back upon other civilizations from the Bronze Age or something, and we critique them based on our own awareness, our own moral consciousness, and not allowing them to breathe, as it were, to be people who are themselves in a developmental process, where they emphasize community and stability, or keeping things orderly. And we, of course, emphasize privacy. We emphasize individualism. We emphasize freedom, democracy, and so forth. And those were values that were not on the table for ancient Near Eastern people. And so we just need to understand that. So that's one thing to keep in mind as well. And we also need to understand, too, that when we look at the ancient Near East and God working with Israel, God is working with a fallen people, people who are within settings where there are faulty assumptions, and we need to remember what Jesus himself said, that God gave Moses to Israel, gave these laws to Israel because of the hardness of human hearts. That some of those laws were assuming that human beings would sin, that human beings would be involved in structures that were less than ideal. And so God steps into a messy world, gets his feet dirty and hands bloody, as it were. That God, he steps into a world that is a departure from the original creation that he had made. So he's got to start somewhere. But yet God is doing something remarkable in that he is doing something redemptive, that he meets the Israelites where they are, but he moves them in a redemptive direction. And this is really reflected in a lot of the distinctive laws and the mindset, the worldview that God is presenting to the Israelites that they need to adopt, which is far superior to what we see going on in other cultures surrounding Israel at that time. So those are some things that I'm often bringing out. I know I'm just giving you some teasers here that we can elaborate upon, but those are some very important things that often get lost in this whole discussion. And we need to remember that God is starting where people are, meeting them part way, but seeking to move them into a redemptive direction.
Let me just mention, too, that this is in the Worldview Bulletin, which I would encourage you to subscribe to, but we have posted this article. But for those of you maybe that aren't looking at the computer right now, we can maybe number 1 to 5. And the first point, which I think is a really good one, and that is the principle of the fact that we need to maybe a little more humility and maybe even some charity, recognizing that there is a tendency to be in the 21st century to believe that we have structures of government, we have all sorts of things that we take for granted in terms of health and privacy and individualism and democracy and the rest that aren't necessarily true in that Old Testament context where we find ourselves. So first of all, a little bit of humility, point number 1. And then point number 2, God's really dealing with, in this case, people that are just like us, fallen in sin. And actually, I love the quote that you have there, because Jesus was making it very clear at one point when he's talking on the Sermon on the Mount, and he's interacting later on after he's getting questions, say in Matthew 19, about what he said in Matthew 5 and on following, that some of these laws, these Mosaic laws, were permitted because of the hardness of the human heart. And so just because you see some of those laws dealing with, for example, slavery or the concubines and all sorts of other things, wasn't necessarily to mean the ideal or even the vision, but really the laws that had to be implemented in that circumstance. So those are the first 2. When we come back from the break, I want to get into maybe the distinction there between laws and visions, which would be number 3. And then 4 and 5 were the fact that the worldview of Israel, which was part of the Mosaic Law, was very different than what you found in the Near Eastern law collections. And then finally, we'll look at the whole issue of Romans 11:22 and some of those issues as well. So some really important principles. But first of all, you can find that information on our website. But I also would commend to you some of the books by Dr. Paul Copan. We'll continue with him right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Today, your income taxes are due. Of course, those are just some of the taxes you pay each year. This increasing list of taxes we pay are why Kevin Williamson argues that we have enough taxes. He wrote his column because President Biden has been proposing a billionaire's tax that would essentially tax imaginary income. You pay capital gains taxes on income you receive. You don't pay taxes on assets that increase in value that you've not received as income. Biden wants to change that. This is a bad idea for many reasons. First, the value of assets not only go up, they also go down. Think of the stock market. Think of the estimated value of a home that decreases significantly during a housing collapse. Second, the value of an asset can best be assigned when the sale is made. As I said in a commentary recently, my kids used to ask me what something was worth. My standard answer was, it's only worth what another person will pay for it. But, Kevin Williamson also raises another question about the sheer number of taxes. For example, we have taxes on incomes, payroll, capital gains, dividends, tariffs, estates, gasoline, and diesel. We also have such things as tobacco excises, liquor excises, Affordable Care Act excises, and much, much more. We aren't just talking about taxes we need to pay today. We're talking about taxes all the time, often in ways we don't even notice. I wonder if this is by design. In my previous commentary, I asked you to imagine what would happen if we were to pay all our taxes in one lump sum. We would probably have a tax revolt. But when we pay lots of taxes every day and have taxes deducted from our paychecks, well, we don't notice. But we should. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Inflation, go to viewpoints.info/inflation. That's viewpoints.info/inflation.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, talking about some of the questions that our two guests have been most asked. And of course, I can certainly say that whenever I've been talking about the Old Testament, sometimes when we talk about homosexuality and Leviticus or some of the other issues, the question, is God a moral monster, comes up. And whenever I find myself sometimes speaking on maybe intelligent design, or even yesterday at Easter, we're talking about Philip K. Dick and some of the science fiction books, that question of extraterrestrials come up. So these are questions that sometimes will surface. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to read a little bit more about that, first of all, you have the material that we've posted today. And at the moment, talking with Dr. Paul Copan, and that's part of the Worldview Bulletin. Of course, you can also look at some of his books. And in just a minute, we'll be talking with Dr. Melissa Cain Travis about the issue of extraterrestrials. And these are questions that show up all the time, and it would be helpful for you to know some of the answers. First of all, Paul, let's continue, because we've talked about humility and charity. We've talked about the fact that God sometimes accommodates people in their fallen, sinful conditions. Slavery might exist. Women may not be treated the way we'd like them to be. There's a difference in terms of democracy, privacy, individualism, and the rest. But you do also, in your presentations, make a distinction between the laws of the Old Testament and the larger vision. Can you explain that to us?
Sure. As we just were talking about Jesus talked, in the specific context of divorce, Jesus talked about Moses permitting certain laws because of the hardness of human hearts, and particularly the Israelites' hearts. And these were laws that, of course, laws are not giving to us a moral ceiling, as it were. They're giving to us more like the moral floor of what God requires in order to regulate society to keep things in proper order without necessarily giving all of the ideals of a society that God would expect. So when it comes to the laws, we need to separate that from the broader vision that the Old Testament shares with the New Testament, of course, and the New Testament builds on. What we have going on in the starting at Genesis 1 and 2, we see there is a fundamental equality that is assumed. All human beings made in the image of God. So no classism, no racism. Male and female made in God's image. So there's no sexism. We also see that in chapter 2 that there is a fundamental, marriage structure, one man and one woman as one flesh for one lifetime, that is what marriage is to look like. That is what is espoused. So even, as no pun intended, and that this is, even though there is polygamy that is permitted or illustrated in the Old Testament, it's not as though this is God's ideal. That this is, in fact, polygamy is, there's a bad advertising campaign for polygamy in the Old Testament, because wherever you see it, there's negativity, there's division, there is tension, and so forth. So we look at the broader picture of what is the vision? Well, yes, they do have servitude, but fundamentally, as Job says in Job 30, that he and his servants came from the same place, namely the mother's womb. There's a fundamental equality, that Job didn't see himself as morally superior or socially superior to his own servants. So he recognized this, and we see that throughout the Old Testament. Even though there are certain things permitted, the vision is clear, and that even if the society stumbles at certain points, it does live up to the ideal. Keep the broader vision in mind, because that is really what the fundamental point is that we need to keep going back to. A lot of people focus on those individual laws. What about this law? What about that law? Take a look at the bigger vision. Take a look at the bigger sweep of the Old Testament, and you see that the things that are being permitted because the hardest of human hearts aren't reflecting that broader vision that permeates the Old Testament.
Well, and also you talk about the fact that really the Mosaic Law very different than the Near Eastern worldview and the law collections there. And we today assume compassion, and yet compassion really is almost kind of a New Testament concept that comes out, because in some cases compassion or equality were not necessarily values in which much of this was communicated, and yet you find that in the law code of Moses, but you don't find it in most of the other pagan civilizations around them, do you?
Absolutely. It's important that we understand that the law of Israel, even though there may be some borrowing from laws, and I go into more detail on that in my forthcoming book, Is God a Vindictive Bully? That there are certain laws that are borrowed, and this is part of God's general revelation, just like the book of Proverbs borrows from other cultures regarding certain noted wise sayings of the day. So that's part of God's general revelation, and so there's no problem there. But when it comes to the actual structures of society and the vision that undergirds what Israel is about, keep in mind what God says. It tells the people in Deuteronomy 4:6, the Lord's people are told to keep the Mosaic law. It says, because if they do so, the people around them will see their wisdom and their understanding. So what is going on here is that these people are going to recognize that there is a greater moral understanding or awareness that rises head and shoulders above what these other ancient Near Eastern cultures are themselves living under. And so this is to be a point where the Israelites stand out. And so when it comes to classism, the Israelites are highly democratized in their legal structure, and all laws apply to all people, and they don't make exceptions because you're of this or that class. Whereas in other ancient Near Eastern law codes or collections, you had different punishments for different strata of society. So the ones who were the nobility got off more lightly than those who were of the lower strata. Also, you don't have laws that really show compassion or concern for foreigners, but the Israelites are very much concerned about those who are the most vulnerable within a society, and that would include aliens in their midst. A slave runs away rather than returning him to his master, which other ancient Near Eastern law codes insisted on. The Israelites were to have them settle in, these runaway slaves settle in any of their cities. So Israelites have gleaning laws, other ways of helping the poor. They have ways of helping people get out of debt. Again, something very different than what you see in these surrounding ancient Near Eastern law collections.
Final point, and then I'll let you go, and then we'll go to, of course, Melissa Cain Travis after the break. And that is, you talk about Romans 11:22 reminds us of the kindness and the severity of God. You see in Lamentations, for example, God's grieved in having to bring judgment. And so there is a sense in which we trust in the goodness of God, even though sometimes it seems harsh to us, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly right. Paul, some people say, oh, look, the God of the Old Testament is harsh. The God of the New Testament is loving. Paul says in Romans 11:22, behold the kindness and severity of God. That God is one who he is severe, but that is not his default mode. The default mode is God wants to show love and compassion, and that when he afflicts, he does so reluctantly. He does not like that. It's not as though he delights in that. He delights in blessing rather than bringing judgment. And so this is something that you see cutting across both testaments. And it's like what we see with C.S. Lewis when he writes about Aslan, that Aslan is good, but he is not safe. And so this is what we ought to emphasize, that even as we look at the Old Testament text, we see the flood of Noah or the firstborn of Egypt being slain. We see that God is reluctant to do this. God is grieved when he is doing these things. So this is not what God delights in. It is rather what happens when wicked people rise up, when they dehumanize one another. And so God is rightfully angry when this sort of a thing takes place. And so God brings judgment upon people precisely because they are doing the sorts of things that harm others. And if God did not get angry or wrathful, it would be a sign that he does not care. And that's precisely what we need to emphasize as well.
Well, again, Dr. Paul Copan has been with us, and again, he's at Palm Beach Atlantic University. His upcoming book is God, a Vindictive Bully, Reconciling the Portrayals of God in the Old and New Testament. I think that's an answer to the comment I got the other day. It seems like God took Prozac between the Old and the New Testament. And, so we're looking forward to that book. I know it's coming out in October, and of course, we will have you back there as well. One of the questions you're most asked is, of course, is God a vindictive bully? Is God a genocidal monster? A moral monster? And I think you've helped us answer that question. So let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to look at the other part of that in the Worldview Bulletin, because we'll be talking with Dr. Melissa Cain Travis. And this question shows up all the time in different situations. What about the ETs? Let's hope they're ETs, not aliens. What about extraterrestrials? Would Christ indeed have to die multiple times for different planets and different parts of the universe? That's some really good questions. And she is certainly capable of answering those, and we will talk with her right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
One of the other questions we oftentimes get is, what about extraterrestrials and aliens? And of course, you think about that because of E.T., the extraterrestrial, Alien, so many science fiction movies. And of course, it's a question at the very heart of Contact, which is a movie based on a book by Carl Sagan, in which Jodie Foster plays Ellie Arroway, and as a result receives these transmissions from Vega, about 26 light years away. way she and Matthew McConaughey and a number of others go through this question of, well, are we alone in the universe? And after all, the universe is very large. And so how do we think that through? So that's one of the other questions that individuals are often asked. And the individual that joins us now is Dr. Melissa Cain Travis. She has her PhD in humanities with a philosophy concentration from Faulkner University. In the past, of course, we've talked about the fact that she has a bachelor's degree in science from Campbell University, a Master of Arts in Science and Religion from Biola, and is the author of the book Science and the Mind of the Maker, what the conversation between faith and science reveals about God. Of course, she's also a contributor to, of course, what we've just been talking about, the Worldview Bulletin, and is the president of the Society for Women of Letters. And so, Melissa, welcome back to Point of View.
Hi, thank you for having me on the show.
I'm sure you get that question quite often. I know I do, because I tend to speak on some of these science issues. And there are all sorts of questions in their mind because, well, okay, does the Bible speak to it? Not really. But if indeed there was a fall on earth, would Jesus have to go and deal with a fallen world elsewhere? So kind of work our way through some of the material that we've posted on the website.
Sure. So because I'm a specialist in the area of science and religion and how we harmonized Christian theology with the findings of modern science, I frequently get questions related to the possibility of life in other parts of the universe. And as you just mentioned, Scripture is essentially silent on the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence, or ETI. But it raises some interesting questions. Like, what if one day we were to discover signs that intelligent life lived in some far-off galaxy? What if we did discover intelligent beings living on some exoplanet in some solar system elsewhere in the Milky Way, for example? What would that mean about the doctrine of the fall, the doctrine of Christ's incarnation, and the doctrine of the atonement where these creatures are concerned? Historically, Christianity has understood being made in the image of God as overlapping with the idea that we are rational creatures. That's part of what it means to be made in the image of God. And so if there were rational creatures elsewhere, what happens to their souls? You know, this called into question the idea of God's divine justice. And often materialists or non-theists of one stripe or another will make fun of Christianity's alleged inability to deal with those kinds of questions. And you'll hear these sneering remarks like, oh, do you believe in a planet-hopping Jesus? In other words, this idea that Jesus had to visit countless other planets in the universe in order to incarnate and have a ministry and then atone for the sins of all of these different extraterrestrial races. And so,
yeah.
But
No, I was just going to go on because one of the things I would encourage people to read in your piece is you have one article that appeared in Scientific American with the provocative title, Did Jesus Save the Klingons? But again, there's an attempt to say this, if we were to discover life on another planet and even in another galaxy, or we were to somehow get contact, we wouldn't meet them, but we might see some kind of transmission. Would that then disavow major religions? And my answer is no, but that's kind of the sneering way that a lot of the skeptics have used this idea to make fun of Christianity, don't you think?
Yes, exactly. In other words, well, your scripture doesn't say anything about these creatures, and look at all the theological conundrums that result from it. But I see no theological conundrum whatsoever, because we are finite creatures with a very limited scope of physical reality, let alone spiritual reality and the very mind of God and his activities beyond what we can be aware of. And so I see no problem whatsoever with the idea that, yes, he could have incarnated in other places and he could have atoned for the sins of other alien races. But I don't think that's the only way to solve the theological issue of the salvation of extraterrestrial intelligences.
And if nothing,
we have to remember.
Yeah, go ahead. Because I was just going to say that's, I think, illustration again of what we oftentimes call a straw man argument. And you're an expert in philosophy. You know what that is.
Yeah, exactly. It's trying to make it sound absurd, especially, as I said, by using funny language like the planet hopping Jesus. But one of the things I point out in my Worldview Bulletin piece is we need to be careful not to have a very limited understanding of the attributes of God. And the ones that I particularly name are God's omnipresence. He's present in all of his creation, far beyond what we have access to observationally, and his omnibenevolence. So if there are extraterrestrial intelligences, and let's just hypothesize that because they are rational creatures, they too would be image bearers, that he would desire that they come to a saving knowledge of him. But in terms of the omnipresence and his transcendence of the space-time continuum, I don't think we necessarily have to see his incarnation and atonement in other places as something happening in chronological succession. And that is a little bit mind-bending because we're so used to a succession of moments in time. That's how we exist. That's how we live our lives. But God is outside of this space-time continuum. So one of the things we might speculate is, well, perhaps his incarnation and atonement were simultaneous in all of these places. What is there in Scripture that would rule out that possibility? I really don't see one. And so that's just one example of an answer that we might give, a hypothesis we might extend in response to someone who says, well, how does this not make Christianity absurd to say that Jesus had to be crucified countless times?
So good. Let me also encourage people to go to your website. It's melissacaintravis.com. You don't have to remember all that. We've got all those materials on our website. But you did a podcast a while back on the pursuit of meaning in a godless universe. So I want to turn it around for just a minute. Instead of saying, well, how would your Savior deal with this? I think there is a better question to ask our atheist friends that love science, as you and I do, but don't have a belief in God. And that is, how do you get any kind of meaning, significance at all in a universe if you're convinced there is no God and there is no Jesus?
Oh, that's exactly right. And that's probably my favorite topic of conversation with a non-believer, because what I have found is that argument and evidence concerning science will not get you very far with someone of that mindset unless you first help them see how very, very expensive their own worldview is. And by expensive, what I mean is if they follow the materialist paradigm out to its logical conclusion in every area, there are very precious things that they have to give up, things that are central to human existence, things without which we could not even have human civilization. And those would be things like morality, like purpose, value, and so on and so forth. These immaterial things that would not exist if we did not have genuine free will, for example. And under the materialist worldview, we're just meat robots. We don't have genuine free will. So what sense would it make to criticize someone for their beliefs if those beliefs are just the result of their brain chemicals acting in response to environmental stimulus, for example? So they don't get free will, therefore they don't get morality, no such thing as right and wrong, good and evil, and there's no meaning, value, or purpose to their existence. Any meaning, purpose, or value they claim to have is entirely subjective. It's just invented in their own minds.
So good. Well, again, Melissa Cain-Travis, it's always good to have you on the program. Again, I would commend people to your website. We also, of course, have posted this piece. The question I'm asked most, parts 1 and 2. We had Dr. Paul Copan on, and you as well. And we look forward to the next opportunity. It's great to have some people doing apologetics from a scientific background. You're one of those individuals that we want to give a platform for, and so look forward to the next opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Going to take a break. Spend just a little bit of time talking about a couple other issues in the news, and then we'll prepare you for some of the things we're going to be talking about tomorrow. All that coming up right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just give you an idea of what we'll be covering tomorrow. First of all, Dr. David Geisler will be with us, and we'll be talking about this new documentary about Dr. Norman Geisler. And will again allow us to get into the issue of apologetics and especially evangelism. David Geisler is, of course, quite the expert on evangelism, so we'll be talking about that for a while. And also just the incredible impact that One Life had, and also how an individual who really had trouble reading and writing through high school ended up writing more than 80 books. So again, it's a great story, and I think you will enjoy it. We'll talk about the documentary and the way in which you could see the film yourself. And then the next hour, we'll spend a little bit of time talking with Bill Haslam about his book, Faithful Presence. So all of that is relevant. And I'm wondering whether I should do a commentary on this. If I did, I would add some of the material from Melissa Cain Travis, but also something else that has surfaced, and that is the more we've talked about this idea of intelligent design here on Point of View, we have seen that scientists recognize that the number of parameters necessary to have life on this planet are huge. The number of parameters necessary to have something like intelligent life is even larger. And when you start with maybe an evolutionary assumption that all these parameters came together just by chance, you run the numbers, and it says it is unlikely to even have planet Earth in the universe, much less in this galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy. So that, if indeed is true, would suggest that actually we indeed may be the only intelligent life anywhere in the universe, at least in the human level. Of course, that questions whether or not you think we're all that intelligent. But again, I'll leave that joke for another day. But it illustrates again that the likelihood of extraterrestrials is diminishing over time. Carl Sagan, who wrote the book Contact, which became the movie Contact, was really based on the assumption that the universe should just be brimming with life and human life and advanced civilizations, and maybe not. And so that's something else to think about as well. Little Green Man and Lights in the Sky is a book about that. We've got, even at Pro Ministries, done some things. Are we alone in the universe? There some interesting things to think about. But nevertheless, it's a question that she receives quite frequently. So I thought it'd be good for us to address it here on Point of View. Just before we run out of time, let's mention my last article here, because this one is not a victory. Remember, I started out by talking about all the victories. This one is not a victory, but I think it's going to be pretty quickly. And that is, there have been all sorts of people criticizing not only the governor of the state of Florida, Ron DeSantis, but also some of the people in the educational wing, because they have done a checking of these various textbooks and found that a very significant number, the number I've seen, and I've seen different numbers, but let me use this number, that 54 math textbooks actually did not meet the standards because they attempt to indoctrinate students with critical race theory. And so the attempt has been to say, look, we want to teach our kids math, but we don't want a math book that in one way or another is actually trying to sneak in various kinds of woke ideology. Now, the reaction, which came from one state representative, was DeSantis is hysterically pulling math books out of Florida schools, claiming they indoctrinate kids with critical race theory. This isn't just crazy white right-wing pandering. Next, they'll spend millions of tax dollars forcing schools to buy math books from Republican campaign donors. Yeah, I guess he could be forgiven for thinking that this kind of hysterical statement is going to help. We've seen how that has backfired time and time again. But I've posted this article because, as I say, don't trust Governor DeSantis. Don't trust me. You can read it for yourself. And one of the individuals actually has posted some math homework. And it's pretty interesting. Now, this math homework turns out from Missouri, but it gives you the idea in which to answer these questions about Maya Angelou. How does she show up in a math textbook? Well, what it is that you have to move and do the algebra to then figure out whether it's A, B, or C. First of all, I would suggest you, having been through enough math classes to actually say, I know what math is about, you don't answer math questions A, B, C, okay, a multiple choice. You answer with the correct number. But nevertheless, if you work the two math problems, and it's where you have to plug an X equals into a Y, you can then come up with the two answers for X and Y. Then that helps you understand whether or not Maya Angelou was sexually abused by her brother's boyfriend, brother, or father, whether she worked as a pimp, prostitute, or bookie, a drug dealer, or nightclub dancer, and on and on and on. Stuff that you go, and this is in a textbook, a math textbook? Oh, yes, it is. And so, first of all, again, it just is an illustration. And again, great story of the woman, by the way, Nobel laureate poet. Okay. But I think it was just one example of many others in which, even while you're teaching math, you're trying to indoctrinate individuals with a particular racial perspective or whatever it might be. And I love what the person that posted this homework said. No wonder China is winning. And if you haven't figured it out, we as a country are almost always embarrassed whenever they apply international studies and tests to individuals. And one that I remember from many years ago, and that goes back quite a while, but it was brought to my attention by Bill Bennett and Gary Bauer because they'd served in the Department of Education. They had these tests on math, and at the end, they ask a series of questions. Which universities did the best, which colleges did the best, which high schools did the best, which countries did the best. And I'll simplify it by simply saying that when you did a comparison of high schools, for example, I think South Korea was at the very top and American high schools were near the bottom. But there was one particular question where Americans did best. It was the question of, how did you think you did on the test? And the American students thought they did really well. But of course, they did not even come close to reaching the level of kids in South Korea, in Taiwan, in China, and a variety of other places. And it, I think, is a testimony, a very sad testimony indeed, of where American education is today. And so I love her line, no wonder China's winning. But you can read it for yourself. You can actually go and do the test and see if you can come up with the right answers, because there's a little bit of algebra and all the rest. And it just gives you a reason for why. In the state of Florida, they're saying, we're just not going to put up with this. We have to compete on an international level. We need to produce the best and brightest students for the 21st century. 3 cheers for the Department of Education there in the state of Florida. Just before we run out of time, I might mention that if you haven't turned in your taxes, you might want to do it today. And my commentary today is called Enough Taxes, because I point out, in addition to paying your income taxes, we also pay taxes for payroll and capital gains and dividends and tariffs and estates. And we pay gas taxes and diesel taxes and tobacco excises and liquor excises, and on and on and on. We have too many taxes. And I think if we actually really understood how much we paid in taxes, we would probably have a tax revolt. So that's my commentary for today. If you haven't turned in your taxes, need to get them to the post office even as you're listening to us right now, because the taxes are due today, April 18th. That's all we have for today. I want to thank Andrew for his help as an engineer. I want to thank Steve as working behind the scenes to get Paul Copan and Melissa Cain Travis all together, as well as Eric Ortlund. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.